Story 1. That my parents had to get married. They always told us they got married in 1961, but it was 1962, 3 months before my sister was born. What's amusing is that my father was an accountant who was incredibly fast with math. Whenever he was asked how many years they'd been married, he'd be off by one. My mother would correct him through clenched teeth, and then my father would nod and agree. Story 2. When my paternal grandfather died, the federal government reached out to conduct a state funeral. He had been career Army and a colonel, so we didn't question it. Then the funeral came, and they went all out. There was a huge procession and people showing up who were really big names like heads of departments, senators, retired senators, people from the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department. It was nuts, and we were all super confused. Turns out he was a key figure in the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, and when the Office of Strategic Services splintered into the Central Intelligence Agency and Secret Service, he went the Secret Service route. He wasn't on White House detail, but instead worked in a covert office that dealt with counterfeiting and currency. He went blind when I was a toddler and retired from the Army. For whatever reason, he told no one about all his covert work with the Office of Strategic Services and the Secret Service, and the only person who knew, my grandmother, was sworn to secrecy and never told anyone. My father grew up thinking he was just a colonel working on base. Only after his death were we given all sorts of interesting things like publications by him, lectures given by him, and all kinds of things from various endeavors he pursued and was known for. All I knew him as was a blind old man who was perpetually smoking, drinking, and being a crotchety person. Turns out he was an incredible individual, and none of us knew. Story 3. My great-grandmother wasn't actually Mexican but was adopted by a Mexican family from a Chinese family who was being kicked out of Mexico when railroad construction was over. She always had more typically Asian features but only spoke Spanish, and it was never really questioned. 23andMe is a hell of a thing. Story 4. In the 1970s, a dead girl was found on my grandpa's property. Everyone, including the local police, just assumed she was in with a bad crowd and murdered by drug dealers. In the 1990s, some of his grandkids came forward about all the molestation. After that, people started to realize Grandpa probably killed that girl. Story 5. My mother is kid number 7 of 10. My aunt, kid number 4, who was born in 1945, did her DNA test and found out that she has a different father from everyone else. She was devastated. There was always a rumor that there was an affair, but nobody talked about it. She has so many questions, but nobody is alive to answer her. Story 6. This is kind of messed up, but my parents told me my mom had a bad back because I pushed on her spine during birth. This was what I thought all my childhood. I think I was in my teens when my older brother told me my dad pushed my mom during an argument, and she fell and had to have surgery. I thought I ruined my mom's back my entire childhood, and those SOBs let me believe it. Story 7. When I was 5 years old in 1988, Santa Claus left a Nintendo on our front porch. It was wrapped in newspaper, and my parents had no idea who gifted it to us. My dad, particularly, tried to figure it out. He was always suspicious that it had been a family friend. It was by far the best gift of the year, and we played it all the time throughout our childhood. My dad died in 2004. Last Christmas, my mom explained that she was the one who had bought it and secretly placed it on the porch. My dad really liked to be in control of things and had forbidden the purchase. She knew better. She didn't tell a soul for 30 years. Thanks, Mom. Story 8. My grandparents are first cousins. An uncle on the same side of the family is in prison for the assassination of a presidential candidate. The family still says he was framed and is innocent. Story 9. I see a lot of stories about people discovering that those they thought were their parents were not the ones who raised them, and this one is a little bit different. My dad always suspected that the father who raised him wasn't his biological dad, and the father thought the same. He was treated terribly by his father because the father was told he couldn't have children, and my father was born prematurely, but at a healthy weight. So, everyone assumed my grandmother had an affair and got pregnant with my dad. It was to the point that after my grandmother died, my grandfather failed to even mention to his new wife that he had a son and grandchild, me. Years later, my dad took an ancestry DNA test for both him and me. He found out that his dad was actually his biological dad. It was shocking and sad. Story 10. My de facto uncle, he and my aunt have never married but have been together since well before I was born, with a few hiccups, has a child with another woman. It became common knowledge when the girl was 6 and was starting to understand the situation. At first, it was a bit scandalous, but she's been welcomed with open arms by my entire family, including her half-siblings' maternal grandparents. She's treated the same as all the other kids her age. Her half-sister, my cousin, has a daughter the same age, and they're best friends, go to the same high school, totally inseparable, technically aunt and niece. She comes to all our family events, and she's an awesome kid. We're all delighted to have her in our family. Story 11. After my mom died, I found out the real story behind my parents' marriage. She came to my father's country to visit some of her relatives, met my father, and after just 1 week, she asked him to marry her so she could stay in the country. My father accepted because he had no one else, and his parents were pressing him to get married already. But the highlight of the story is that over time, the two of them fell in love with each other. Their love only grew over time, and they were really happy together. My mother spent her last days very ill, and she would accept only my father by her bedside. He swears to this day that she was an angel sent from God to take care of him. I am shocked that they got married just like that, out of the blue, and ended up loving each other so deeply. I can only hope to have as good and loving a marriage as they had. I had no idea my parents' little secret would touch so many people. Thank you all, it means a lot. Story 12. My uncles are infamous criminals who killed multiple people. I thought they bred dogs. Thank you for the awards. The only good thing that ever came from this. Story 13. About a month ago, my mother-in-law's 88-year-old sister revealed on her deathbed that her husband's best friend was actually the father of all 4 of her children. Her husband was an abusive, grade-A jerk by all accounts. While everyone was shocked, no one was saddened by this news. Story 14. My uncle served in Vietnam. While over there, his troop found a baby that had been orphaned or abandoned. They aren't sure. My uncle was shipping back to Australia soon and wanted to adopt him, but my aunt said no. They had only been married about 4 months when he was drafted. So while I don't agree with my aunt's actions and generally don't like her as a person, I can understand why she said no. My uncle's troop found a family to raise the baby, and that's the story the whole family knows. The secret is that my uncle and some other guys from his troop stayed in contact with the family and the kid, sending them money every month to help raise him and then to help him go to university, and eventually helped him and his adoptive family move to Australia in the late 1990s. My aunt and the rest of my family had no idea all this time. It only came out when my aunt and uncle divorced in 2017, and she had a forensic accountant go through their bank records. She worked at a bank for over 40 years and always noticed the money missing, but his reasons were always justified. Since we all know now, my uncle has introduced some of us to the guy and his family. They're all really lovely people. To clarify why my aunt is a bad person in this instance. I was half asleep when I posted this and realized I left out a pretty important detail to explain why I don't like my aunt for this. To preface, I'm child-free, and if my husband was in this situation, I'd say no as well. It's not the fact that she said no to adopting the kid that makes me dislike her for this. It's her reason. My aunt is very racist against Asian people. It doesn't matter what part of Asia. She hates them. She's the kind of person who will yell, "Go back to your own country," at random strangers who even vaguely look like they may have Asian ancestry. She also cut contact with my cousin, her daughter, because my cousin's husband is half Japanese. She said in front of my family with no shame that if the kid hadn't been Asian, she would have said yes to adopting him. Story 15. I only just recently heard about this, but my grandmother had gotten a little drunk with my dad and brother a month or so ago and started talking about our great-uncle Ferber, but from what I heard, he apparently killed quite a few people and buried them on some family-owned land in a swamp. Story 16. My great-grandfather didn't die of cancer. He died from complications after being shot when one of his businesses was being robbed. Maybe. He also spent a lot of time in Atlantic City. He also had a lot of partners in the Teamsters and other unions in coal country. Also, Everyone called him Smiling Tony, but his name wasn't Tony. He died in the 1960s, long before my time, but when my great-grandmother died 20 years ago, a very old guy showed up to the funeral in a white suit, and all of the oldest people in my family kissed his hand. When I asked, no one knew who he was. My grandfather moved his family away from central Pennsylvania in the late 1960s and disconnected from all of this, but there it is. Story 17. When I was 28, I found out that my dad was not my biological father. The news came out as my dad was battling depression and was suicidal. So I had just flown home to try to take care of him and rescue him from my mom's wrath. My mom had verbally and emotionally abused him during their entire relationship. He loved her so much and he tolerated it. During a solemn walk with my dad, as I tried to help him, he confided that he's not my biological dad. He knew this all along, but my mom lied to him and tried to convince him he was my biological father. He knew he wasn't, but he wanted to play the role. When I was 10 years old, my mom finally confessed this to him. He worried that upon hearing the news, he'd somehow let this affect his relationship with me. So, at 28, during this walk with my dad, as he poured out the story, he framed it by telling me that his two most proud moments in his life are how I turned out and his raising me, and that he had completely forgotten about the news from my mom when I was 10, about him not being my biological father. It briefly crossed his mind when tucking me in at night, and he knew then that nothing would come between us. He also confided that my mom did hard drugs while pregnant with me, and this broke his heart. They were very poor. My dad grew up in a foster home without parents. My mom grew up with 6 siblings and ill-equipped parents. She dropped out of 9th grade, while all her other siblings dropped out earlier, and many are barely literate. Now, in my mid-30s, tragically, my dad committed suicide in mid-March 2020, right as COVID-19 was hitting. I was out of the country but immediately flew 30 hours and made it in time for his funeral. I do everything in his honor. Wow! This thread blew up overnight. My most popular comment by 2 orders of magnitude, and it's about my sorrow. I'm just glad so many of you read about how amazing my dad was, and I truly appreciate the outpouring of kind, thoughtful words and wishes. It warms my heart. I could go on about how amazing he was. After graduating from the orphanage at age 18, he moved to Atlanta by himself and taught himself woodworking. He was incredible and would build fine furniture pieces for renowned interior decorators, and his items would be in magazines. He was a starving artist, and we always struggled to get by. Yet, I felt like a spoiled kid on my street, as I had life easier than everyone else. The other kids on my street lived in trailer homes and had very chaotic households. It was clear both my parents loved me immensely, and I felt well provided for and supported. I was very lucky to have him in my life. I still think about him daily, and I'm trying to improve emotionally. I appreciate everyone sharing your similar stories, and it provides a sense of camaraderie. Hearing the shared pain and empathy, and seeing that this resonated with so many people, motivates me to write a book that would include snippets from my relationship with him. From my eulogy to him, which I wrote while flying to his funeral, his hard work. For my entire upbringing, he worked every single day in his shop, long hours, and didn't even take a day off for Christmas or his birthday. As a kid, I witnessed his work ethic, and it left an impression on me. Importantly, he didn't appear to be working for someone else. He was working for himself. He found what he loved, woodworking, and he immersed himself in it and dedicated his life to making perfectly crafted items. He had passion, a pursuit of perfection, and an unlimited dedication to fuel it. He didn't just work, he made masterpieces. When I was 18 and left home for college, I aspired to be like my dad. He set the example. I was trying to make something of myself and give it my all just like he did. His work ethic was ingrained in me. I would get 4 to 5 hours of sleep many nights. It was hard, but I always thought about how much harder my dad worked. I recalled memories of him working late at night, the saws spinning, the compressor running, and huge sawdust piles under his table saw. He did so much to provide for our family. He always provided. When I was 18, starting college, I was trying to make him proud and do everything I could to have the opportunity to do anything I wanted. Not just for myself, but on behalf of my dad. A part of me felt that whatever opportunity one gained, whatever success I had, was in hopes that he too would somehow benefit. He deserved the world, and I've been trying to channel his hard work, his creative problem-solving abilities. Not only did my dad work relentlessly hard, but he found creative solutions to everything. He dedicated his life to solving problems and designing furniture. There is no physical item he could not figure out. His ability was way beyond anything I've ever witnessed. None of my colleagues could come close to having my dad's unique ability to creatively make things work. Whatever the problem, my dad could find a solution. When he was 12, he was excited to learn you could repair radios just by replacing diodes. As a kid, he made me an incredible treehouse with its own electricity line. As a teenager during an ice storm in Georgia that caused massive power outages, my dad rigged up a portable TV with a car battery so we could watch TV despite not having power. His vehicles had many contraptions and workarounds, often like modern-day Flintstones cars. This was how he did things his entire life. His strength and character. His perseverance was unmatched. He handled so much adversity, especially the past 10 years when he was in so much pain. He was the strongest person I've ever met. In recent years, he experienced and recovered from Stevens-Johnson syndrome, a rare, deadly skin disorder. He was resilient beyond belief and endured many personal obstacles. His strength wasn't just in his ability to endure, but in his bravery. I have many stories where he saved the day in crises. He was fearless. Not only was he courageous in character, but he was also physically strong. In his 60s, he could often lift more than I could in my 30s, despite my interest in weightlifting. Vulnerability and gentleness. Once I became an adult, he admitted tough moments to me. He was willing to confide in me painful times he endured. He called on me for help and told me when he wasn't strong enough. We all feel this way at times. He was vulnerable enough to cry. He showed me that one's willingness to show vulnerability is a product of strength and bravery. Closing. As I close, I want to mention one of my favorite artists, Alanis Morissette, who challenges us by asking, how about remembering your divinity? How about unabashedly bawling your eyes out? How about not equating death with stopping? To this effect, I know that my dad will continue to inspire and influence me for the rest of my life, without question. I am who I am because of him. I've always aspired to uphold the principles he stood for. I hope that others see in me his virtues and pieces of his personality. I want to continue his legacy. Thus, he hasn't stopped. Further, I challenge all of you to never equate death with stopping. That is, we can do better than just remembering someone. We can continue to learn from what they taught us, like the elements I've mentioned. 1. When you find something you love, whether it's work or a hobby, put everything you have into it. Be willing to think creatively to solve problems. Take the time to enjoy life's so-called minutiae, the alleged trivial details. Be willing to play and be silly. Don't take yourself too seriously. Be brave. Be strong. Be so strong that you're willing to be vulnerable. Be a teacher and be a lifelong student. Mean everything you say and speak earnestly. Connect with others. Form a community. Be there for others. We could all benefit from the help of others, so be unafraid to rely on others for support. I would do anything to have my dad here today. In his own words, which he often told me, it's not what happens to you, but how you handle it. So again, I urge you all to handle this tragedy by staying strong, connecting with the community and the support of others, and continuing to learn from my dad. Thank you all for being here. It means the world to me, and I know it means the world to my dad.